I want to even move away from the metaphysical here. I want to say on a purely scientific sense that we are this earth, right? We this is the stuff that's in our lungs, in our blood, and we return to the earth and we come from the earth. And we belong to it. We belong to each other. And to me, that's the story that the mystics, in all of their various stripes and flavors and forms, are coming to tell. And it's not a pansina. It's not a pill that you swallow and it fixes anything. It's a charge. It's a calling to live as if that's true. That's the story that I want to be engaging in and articulating and trying to live and failing, but getting back up and trying again.
Alrighty. Well, it's really wonderful to sit down with you, Zevi. It's an honor to be here. Could you start by, would you like to introduce yourself and the Jewish community that you grew up in?
Yeah, firstly, thank you guys so much for having me. It's delightful, delightful to join you here in conversation. I grew up in Sydney, Australia, in the Chabad Hasidic community. My parents were sent there as emissaries by the seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe. So that was quite a fun childhood, growing up with a real sense of mission and purpose, trying to bring a really beautiful indigenous form of Jewish mysticism that took shape in 18th century Eastern Europe to a very modern articulation, modern world. And I think in many ways that set me on the trajectory that I still find myself involved with today.
Yeah, that's awesome. I hadn't heard that you were part of this almost, dare I say, evangelical side of Judaism that usually isn't the center of it. But I personally see a lot of value in sharing and extending our perspectives, our spirituality to other communities. Here with the Jewish Diasporist, we're really interested in how the movement of Jewish people, the movement of Jewish ideas has cultivated diverse traditions. Uh, how do you see your own personal familial history tying into this broader picture of Jewish diaspora across the world? And at all, how has that inspired or deepened your spiritual practice?
Yeah, it's a strange kind of thing because we don't think about Judaism as being evangelical. But I think that this sense that if you have something that's worth having, then it's also worth sharing in some sense. And and there's a gift there of sharing beauty. You know, there's this experience when you encounter like a really exquisite piece of artwork, whether it's a film or a painting or a poem or a piece of literature. There's a sense that you just want to share that with someone else, and that comes from a place of like care and love and the ability to connect as humans over shared beauty. So to me, that's very much how I see the form of evangelism that I was raised on, not in the sense of superiority or dogmatism or trying to convert anyone to something new, but simply of really experiencing a deep form of beauty and wanting to share that from that human place of wanting to share beauty. My own family, sort of within that community and within that lineage, is a bit of a mixed bag in that only one out of four of my grandparents were born into a Hasidic household. The rest, um, the of my two parents were raised myself and my siblings in a Hasidic household, but they all came to it, or their parents came to it in various different interesting ways, and it tracks on some very fascinating historical and demographic movements of Jews moving out of Eastern Europe into the New World and adopting new forms of Jewish spirituality and religiosity. And that's certainly an interesting story. Maybe I'll just share a little snippet from that story, a little anecdote, which is very dear and near to my heart, and which may speak to some of the historical questions that your podcast is looking to answer. My father's father, so my grandfather, grew up in White Russia, in and his father, who I'm named after, was a Lithuanian, what we would call Mitznagdic Jew, so not Hasidic and opposed to Hasidism, in fact. And there were a group of Hasidic young men who were passing through their town, and it was still a very hot moment where the Hasidic and anti-Hasidic community, the Mitznagdic community, were still quite opposed to one another. Today, that animosity has lessened, thankfully. Um, and and the story told in the family is that no one wanted to take these Hasidic young men into their home. And so what they did is they just stayed in the Beit Midrash in the shul, and they just sat there during the day and they learned and they slept on the bench at night because they were, on their way to their next destination. And that was the plan, just to sleep there. And my great grandfather, who I'm named after, Zevi, he by nature was a very kind person, and he was well known, and also he was well to do, and he was well known for having a lot of guests in his home. He had kind of an open home for anyone that was passing through could come and stay, taking after his namesake, Abraham, the first Jew who had a tent open to Bedouins and strangers, and that anyone could come in and have place for respite and safety. And he was kind of perturbed that he wasn't allowed to take these young men into his home by the community standards because they were seen as this kind of dangerous heretical cult and sect. And he just sat there and he kind of watched them, and he was kind of mulling over this question in his heart. And then as he was watching them, he saw these boys, while they were learning Talmud, one of them took their lapel to scratch the back of their neck instead of scratching the neck with their hand. And the reason is because in halacha, when you're engaged in ritual study of Torah, which is a sacred act, we try not to touch parts of our body which are unclean or sweaty. And so therefore the punctiliousness that this young man showed to scratch his neck with his collar as opposed to his skin was enough to make my great grandfather realize that he was, that they were in the same camp when it came to worshiping God with love and fear. And on that grounds of that scratch itself, he invited the boys into his home and disregarded the community's sort of fear around who they were. And as a result, my grandfather was exposed to these young Hasidic men, and he himself was inspired by them and went on to adopt a Hasidic lifestyle, married a Hasidic woman, my grandmother, and had Hasidic children and grandchildren, including myself. So it's kind of very sort of I love this like great anecdotal moment in the life of a young man who like the difference between scratching with his finger or without his finger like went on to change the demographics of the entire community. My life would have been suddenly very different. And it's just these we sometimes we underestimate the meaningfulness of a small moment in our lives, but from a historical and from sociological perspective, those moments are every moment is changing history, sometimes in very dramatic ways. So that's a little anecdotal story about how my father's family came to be Hasidic Jews.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's really interesting. As diasporists, as a historian, frankly, I've been doing Jewish history from like this last year. I did a master's that was essentially a history of what I was calling socialist diasporism. And we've really thought a lot about what diasporism is on its own. And especially when you look at Jewish histories, a lot of modern Jewish histories are really shaped by a Zionist nationalist historical narrative, which is really commonplace throughout most national histories come from a way that's really focused on a specific land and telling this really grand narrative that kind of flattens the importance of family histories within the actual creation of history. And it's really exciting to hear that from you because these little tiny moments can have such a huge impact in the family histories that happen down the road. I was wondering what you think Hasidism in particular has to bring to the wider buffet or library of Jewish spirituality that you think makes it so special and important to engage in for you personally and for like wider Jewish communities.
Yeah, that's a delightful question. Um, I think firstly, I want to broaden the term Hasidism because when we're using it in a modern historical context, we're talking about, and I even made this reference earlier, we're talking about the 18th century movement, which begins with Rabbi Yisrael Bar Shem through to the Maggid and his disciples and the school and the courts and dynasties which followed from that. But the way that you frame the question made me want to expand that term a little because the term Chassid and Chassidut does not begin in 18th century Eastern Europe. It goes all the way back to the Bible and through to the Talmudic period, to the Middle Ages. And there are actually many, many communities and individuals throughout history who use and appropriate and take on this term of chassid, which literally comes from the Hebrew word chesed, which is kindness, but it's come to mean something like pietist or someone who goes beyond the letter of the law, what's required of them, towards the spirit, let's say, of the law. Um, and there's a deep in some sense we could say that Chassid is a Jewish mystic essentially, and that term is used. King David refers to both himself and to God in various parts, or the author of the Psalms refers to both themselves and to God in different places as a Chassid, as this mystic, a pietist, the person of kindness, however we're going to translate this term. We know that there are the Hasidim Harashonim, the early pietists of the Second Temple period. We know that there are the Chesed Mitzrayim, the pietists of Egypt, that are a movement that's led by the son of Maimonides, Abraham, the son of Maimonides. There's famously there's the Chesed Ashkenaz. So there's the pietists of Germany, which are quite influential in early Kabbalah in the 12th and 13th century. So this term, the existence of Jewish spirituality, pietism, depth, has really existed throughout Jewish history and keeps cropping up again. And I think intentionally reattaching themselves to the same word to connect themselves to this lineage. And I think from that perspective, what the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of modern Hasidism, or the retrospective founder of modern Hasidism, is doing, is really continuing this tradition of Jewish interiority. And I think to as we begin to unpack the historical meaning of the word, the case for why it might have something to contribute to Judaism at large becomes self-evident. There's Rabbeinu Bachya writes is it the 10th, 11th century? I might be wrong about that. Writes a book called Chavot HaLevavot, which is the duties of the heart. And he's writing this to set up two forms of duties, which he's actually borrowing perhaps from Sufi literature, where there's the duties of the body and then there's the duties of the heart. And we know a lot in Judaism what the duties of the body is. We know we have 650 commandments, we have a lot of do's, a lot of don'ts, we know what we can eat, what we can't eat. But what's the role of the heart, right? Where does the heart play into that? And the Talmud famously says that Rachmana liba, that the merciful one, God, wants the heart more than God wants our bodily actions. Like, where is the sincerity? Where's the authenticity? Where's our heart at? And I think for me, what's represented in and highlighted in Hasidism of the Baal Shem Tov, in modern Hasidism, is the necessity for authenticity, for humility, for joy, for relationality, for love, for ecstasy, for honesty, in a way that's really heart-centered. And to me, a Judaism without Hasidism, without depth, without heartfulness in one way or the other, is really just like a body without a soul, or a body without a heart. And conversely, if we only have spirituality, we're like a spirit without a body. We're just like a ghost. So I think Judaism really needs its heart, and that's broadly construed is what I mean when I say Hasidism. And I think that the rediscovery of the heart of Judaism in the form of Hasidism, in contemporary and in modern, more progressive and even secular forms of Judaism, both in Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, different forms of Judaism, through teachers like Martin Buber and the various names that come up in that story, is a really, really beautiful moment in Jewish history, which we're witnessing right now.
That's a really beautiful picture of Hasidism, and I hadn't really made the connection between Chassid and Chesed, but Chesed is such a core part of my personal Jewish values of this loving kindness. And I, as an ecologist, found my way back into Judaism through what I called the ecology of love, through thinking about how our loving relationships come back and nourish our souls and ground us in place and connect us to community. And I'm so honored to have you on this podcast and to having this discussion, because it was your project, Seekers of Unity, which introduced me to a much deeper appreciation of the Rambam, Rabbi Moses Maimonides, and Baruch Spinoza, two, as you put them, God-infatuated men. And being able to connect this spiritual love to philosophy, the love of wisdom, has been a really enlightening experience for me. And hopefully many of our listeners here can check that out, because there's a lot of really beautiful work in your backlog of what you've done in the past and the current work you're doing on prayer that I think really can help deepen lots of Jewish people's both Jews who follow the more halachic Orthodox Judaism or Jews who, are maybe a little more secular, but still can find a profound, deep meaning within prayer. I wanted to turn a little bit towards how your Hasidic or neo-Hasidic Judaism has informed your project, the Seekers of Unity, and how you see Chesed and giving back, this give and take and receive. How you all of this has turned into, or rather, how your mission as a chassid, as part of this movement, has transformed as you've moved into a different platform, into a different space, and how that's deepened your spirituality.
I so appreciate the question, Jordan, and I so appreciate the appreciation as well. I feel very lucky that I've fallen into slash chosen this work to be able to be talking about love of self, love of neighbor, love of God, love of wisdom, all in one breath is really a real delight. And I love the focus that you're bringing on an ecology of love. It's such a beautiful and rich term. It reminds me of the dialogues of love from Leon and Breo during the Renaissance. And there's been some good recent scholarship on that as well, which tries to articulate Judaism as a religion of love in its entirety, which I think is just delightful. I think um, I think part of love is, and part of the beauty and challenge of love is just how dynamic it is. And bringing the term ecology to it, it really is. It's a living thing. Love needs nurturing. It needs patience. It needs to be watered. It needs sometimes to be trimmed. It needs boundaries. It's really a living. It's a living organism, which from the perspective of many mystics is the life force of reality itself. And so the truth is that the journey that I've been on as a chassid from the etymology of chesed, of loving kindness, certainly has been a constantly shifting and constantly changing one. It's a rich dynamic relationship with reality, with God, that is never static. And to me, that's both beautiful, and it keeps us alive. It keeps us on our toes. We can never sit on our laurels when it comes to love, but we're always challenged to ask ourselves, what does it mean today to love, to be of service in that love? There's a very interesting before directly answering the question, there's a very interesting phrase around this enigmatic term chassid in the Talmud. The Talmud says, "Ezehu chassid," who is the chassid? And there's different times this Talmud asks this question and answers it differently. And this time the Talmud answers, "Hamit chassid im kono." It turns the word chassid into a verb. The one who does chesed, the one who does loving kindness, im kono, with the one who has acquired them, um, which in Talmudic parlance is a reference to God. God is the one who acquires everything, kone hakol, the one who owns all of existence, which is such a strange term. And we do kindness to that which owns us, right? So there's a sense that we're in this relationship with something which which owns the very ontology of our being, is in its possession, right? We're like a pottery in the hands of the potter, as the liturgy puts it, and we do kindness back in relation to that thing which possesses us. And we could think of possessive in perhaps like a negative way, but I'm thinking more in terms of that line from The Little Prince, where the fox says to the little prince, like, name me and own me so that I can be yours and you can be mine. And that's how I'm thinking of kinyan, of that ownership here, which is also a halachic category, and to do kindness in that relationship. So I feel owned. I feel like I belong to something. I feel called and named to that thing, to that conception of reality, which we go on to anthropomorphize and deify, and in all kinds of fascinating ways. And to be in a relationship of doing chesed with that and to that, which includes myself. And doing that as a chassid is tricky, because as people may know, Hasidism in its contemporary forms can be very myopic and very narrow and very parochial and very limited in what it wants to see as part of its mission or part of its kin. And I'm certainly challenged by love to expand those boundaries to places where Hasidism itself has been perhaps shy or reticent to go. and and in love we make mistakes, and there's a real sense of me feeling compelled by love, but not knowing perhaps where it leads me. Um, a line which Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi repeated often, and I take him as something of a mentor of mine, that paraphrasing the line from the Talmud of Rav Yochanan on his deathbed, who says, "I don't know which way they're taking me. I don't know which way I'm taking myself, whether it's to paradise or to hell." And but in love we do those things. We go down the roads where love compels us, not knowing where they take us. So that's where I am in this moment.
Wow, I think that's really beautiful because I think love is something that's so human, that's really easy to relate to for anyone, whether they're secular, whether they're Jewish, whether they're not Jewish. Really, love is just such a universal phenomenon that we can all really identify and relate with what you just said. And I think what you said before about how Hasidism has quite a myopic and narrow purview is really interesting because there's also, I mean, for me, how I have come to appreciate anything about Hasidism has been through the Neo-Hasidic movement. And the Neo-Hasidic movement, as I understand it, has sought to kind of broaden and more mainstream some values of Hasidism in order to be able to recenter this within a more mainstream Judaism. And the idea of like avodah gashmius, which is like corporeal or physical worship or labor, has a lot of resonance for those of us that are really interested in trying to find a way for spirituality to reinforce and add meaning to our political work or our cultural work in the way that we seek to build community and find a spiritual or even mystical meaning within that. So I was kind of wondering how you understand Neo-Hasidism relative to Hasidism in its more traditional form.
Yeah, what a fun question as well. This is a lot of fun. Um, so neo-Hasidism. What is neo about it? Neo-Hasidism has its roots um prob prob proper probably properly in Hillel Zeitlin. We can trace some earlier roots perhaps to people like Solomon Maimon, although sort of maybe very unintentionally and unconsciously as such. But really with Zeitlin onwards, with Buber and with Heschel, and with Reb Zalman going forward, and other contemporary movement leaders in that movement, they bring something neo to Chassan. They bring something new to it. And it's interesting. I'm fascinated by language. I think if we stop and peer into language, I do this even without thinking. I'm like pulling up etymologies because language really is the medium by which we both communicate, and from a perspective of Jewish mysticism, it's language which constructs reality, both historically and contemporaneously in every moment. So neo-Hasidism is an interesting word if we're gonna look at it closely. Neo is Latin, and Hasidism is is Latinized, right? In that it drops the hard ches and it replaces it with the h. There's a Latinization there. There's in modern Hebrew, it's referred to as Chasidut HaChadasha, new Chasidut. Um, but it's not Naya Chassidus. Naya Chassidus would be the Yiddish way to say new neo-Hasidism. It's neo-Hasidism. There's something very English. There's something very Latinic about it. There's something that puts it in a Christian Western democratic context that Chassidus is not, right? Even to call Chassidus Hasidism is already putting it in the category of isms and doing all kinds of things with that word. So, and I think what we're doing with language here is important. And I'm not saying this as a pejorative or as a criticism of neo-Hasidism. I'm just pointing out simply what's going on linguistically, and when we can unpack those linguistics, because language carries values and meaning and connotations and associations. I think that neo-Hasidism, from my perspective, is is doing a handful of important things. Number one, it's communicating Chassidut to an English-speaking language, or to a Romantic Latin language base. And I think part of the early work that Hillel Zeitlin was doing was literally translating Hasidic concepts and ideas and texts out of their original languages of Hebrew and Yiddish splintered with Aramaic, and putting them into English and into Russian and into German, and putting them in conversation with Nietzsche, which with William James, for example, both important characters for Zeitlin. So the act of translating Chassidut at all is already something neo about it. There's already something Latin about it. And translating is a fraught project, right? The Torah, the Bible, is translated, the Hebrew Bible, importantly, is translated into Greek, right, in the form of the Septuagint. And the Talmud has two things to say about that. Firstly, that the Torah was given at Sinai in 70 languages so that everyone could already understand it. And then when the Torah is translated under the oversight of King Ptolemy in Alexandria, the largest Jewish community in the world at the time, the Talmud says that the world shook. There was like an earthquake which shook the world, which doesn't sound it sounds like a bit of a calamity. And there's a fear and there's a real trepidation in the translation of Torah. And will it be translated right? And there had to be these miracles that ensured that all the translators were simultaneously mistranslating the same text so they wouldn't be misunderstood by the Greek audience. The act of translation is so important and yet really terrifying from a traditional standpoint. Traditions want to hang on to their language. We still, if you go into the streets of Borough Park and Williamsburg, we're still speaking Yiddish. I was raised speaking Yiddish because translating is dangerous, but it's also really necessary. It's necessary if we're going to be in communication with our neighbors. And so the very act of translating Chassidus is already a huge step, dangerous, equally dangerous and important. And then there's bringing Chassidut in relation with modern values and ethics and concerns, like you were mentioning, Ben, where Chassidut, and this is a sensitive point, and I want to be sensitive about it. All human endeavors, as lofty and as inspired as they are articulated in human time and therefore bound and in some ways limited to the constraints of those moments, including the ethical values and constraints and to some degree, as grand and as challenging as the human moral imagination can be, it still is limited by its boundaries. So we think of the prophets of ancient Israel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Hosea, who are these giants of the spirit who are coming to a really depraved world and teaching them about the dignity of the infinite dignity of human life, about the need to protect the stranger and to take care of the widow and the orphan. And yet they're complicit in systems of idolatry and systems of slavery and misogyny and in ways that perhaps their moral imagination was not yet able to expand and breach to. And I think that I'm trying to be careful here with my choice of words. I think that the Hasidism, modern Hasidism, a movement articulated in time, is also bound by its own moral landscape, which it certainly pushes in dramatic and extreme ways. But if we are to continue to be godly and to be Jews worthy of the name of Israel, those who struggle with God, we must continue to challenge our moral boundaries and continue to step into new paradigms and landscapes where love compels us to greater degrees of compassion and acceptance and understanding, and to challenge ourselves in that process and to really honestly do that. And I think part of NeoHasidism in the process of translating Chassidut into a modern language is also trying to translate the values of Hasidism into a modern moral language. And that's where Chassidut meets social action, meets new understandings of what it means to be just and kind in a modern world. And that changes our relationship to the other, that changes, and in my work particularly changes our relationship to the mystical other. How do we see the mystic of another tradition, the spiritual giants of our neighbors? Are they enemies? Are they idolaters? Are they heretics? Are they actually people that are on this journey with us, striving towards the mystery which compels us to love? And I very much think that it's the latter. And I think that's part of a neo-Hasidic band. I don't know. I've never formally identified as neo-Hasidic, but I think these are all the things that make up neo-Hasidism. And insofar as I am translating Hasidic Jewish mysticism into English, I'm putting it in conversation with modern values and concerns. I'm trying to re-examine and reevaluate our relationship with mystical traditions and philosophies outside of Judaism. I think in all those ways, I would be neo-Hasidic perhaps.
Well, with the Jewish diasporist, we're kind of doing something similar. Diaspora is a word, that comes from a particular Greek context. I actually recently was looking into its etymology, and I believe it came out of Alexandria, maybe even specifically in dialogue with the Jewish diasporic experience. But by adding that ism and putting it into the modern context, our language is both confining and liberating because by putting a word to something we're making it uh more accessible to the common person, to someone who maybe doesn't identify as a diasporist but still identifies as a Jew in diaspora, and sees the value of Jewish life in diaspora. Ben, I think you had a
Yeah,
question
I mean,
about that.
that was actually the exact same point I was going to raise. I think the what you just brought up about etymology and thinking about that, it got me thinking. I was like, oh, diaspora, that's a Greek word that we're Latinizing with the ism. But at the same time, there's something deeply diasporist about doing that because just to give there's no dictionary definition of diasporist, and that's part of what got us into this project in the first place. But we've come up with some definitions of our own and different things that we identify as part of diasporism. One thing you mentioned, which is like the really radical intercultural exchange between mystics of different traditions. We kind of also see that as diasporist because if you're living in diaspora, you're living amongst cosmopolitan communities and you're having that real dialogue between people from different cultural roots. And that really enriches our spirituality and our understanding of what it means to be human and what it means to engage in these sort of really deep spiritual traditions in a way that's not superficial and confined to just like halakha and its codified form. But one definition that we've kind of come up with, Jordan and I together, has been that diasporism is the affirmation of one's home in diaspora, while communally, we're not sure about if it just has to be communally, but while communally engaging with and developing one's own cultural roots. And this is something that I think we are doing with the term diasporism, because I think there's something important about really embracing and carrying on the legacy of Jewish diaspora and really affirming that that is the places where we feel at home, while at the same time we are taking Jewish ideas and also putting them in dialogue with the other traditions that we are immersed in. And I think that's really important to really state that because there's something that like the line between what is Jewish and what is not Jewish in this is really blurred. And I do also want to raise a point, Jordan. I know you want to ask another question, but there's there was a recent article in the New York Times that Zach and I were actually interviewed for, that was titled, "Is Israel Part of What It Means to Be Jewish?" And it was ostensibly an article about diasporism. It didn't really put diasporism in a way that I think we understand it. I think it really misconstrued it and was really not happy with how the article put it forward. But one way it did it is it kind of made a dichotomy between diaspora and Israel Palestine. And this is something that while I was in Israel Palestine in May, I met Rabbi David Cooper, who's the organizing rabbi of the Kahila Community Synagogue in Berkeley. And he made the point that we should stop thinking of these as separate, that we should actually start thinking about Israel as part of the diaspora. And I think that's something that's really, really got me thinking. And I haven't really fully resolved these thoughts on like, what does it mean to be part of diaspora when like we are typically contrasting it to a nationalism. And I was wondering if you had heard this term diasporism or thought about it at all, or had any responses to any of these ideas that we've been discussing.
Yeah, these are all fascinating questions, and I appreciate sort of bringing focus to them. The the one thing which came to mind when I saw the name of your project was a book by a professor, Professor Susan Rutland, who is actually a friend of my family. She was the supervising professor for my dad's PhD in Polish Jewish pre-war history, and she's best known for her scholarly work on the history of Australian Jewry. I grew up in Australia, and the title of the book is delightful. It's The Edge of the Diaspora. That's the title of her work. which makes me a diasporist Jew in the extreme, I guess, having grown up on the edge by Professor Rutland's estimation. Um, and I love bringing attention to this. I love the sort of even looking into the word, and I just pulled up the etymology here for myself as well, as insofar as the Oxford Dictionary has it, of to be scattered across, to be diasporan, to be scattered across, which is such an interesting, it almost gives like a material visualization of this process of spreading the Jew across the lands, which is delightful, which evokes all kinds of imagery. The Talmud discusses why the Jews are scattered across the lands, and the Kabbalists discuss that passages in the Talmud in interesting ways. The sense that there's something really to be gained about being spread out, that what looks to us like a event of national trauma of being expelled from our homeland by the Romans turns into some kind of spiritual and material opportunity. The Talmud says that the reason why the Jews are put into exile is so that they can find converts from among the nations of the world to bring back to Judaism, which is, again, not thinking of Judaism as an evangelical proselytizing religion, which may be a modern misunderstanding of Jewish history, particularly during the Roman era, is this insistence that we're scattered across for some kind of purpose. The Kabbalists see this as a notion rooted into the Lurianic idea that there are sparks of God that are diffused throughout the lands, and we have to go there to collect these sparks, partially through the avodah b'gashmiot, the work with corporeality that Ben was mentioning, that we're scattered across in almost to help bring these things back. There's yeah, and I think this point of diaspora as being precisely as being put into relationship with the cultural other is such a rich one. And I can speak to that very briefly from the perspective of the history of Jewish mysticism, which is really my wheelhouse, where we think, so there's two kind of stories of the history of Jewish mysticism. and again, this may fall on the lines of Chassid versus NeoHasid, and I may be pegging myself here in one camp or the other. So there's one version of the history of Jewish mysticism, which is the really the same story told by every tradition about their own mystical tradition, is that it's this really pure, unadulterated, pristine form of wisdom, which goes all the way back to the first, man, Adam and Eve, and then the major works of Kabbalah are given to Moses and Mount Sinai and Abraham, and it's really this very, very ancient tradition. The same way that perhaps in Sufism we speak about Sufi Muslims will speak about Sufism as Idris Shah, for example, in his works presents Sufism as something which predates Islam and goes back to the beginning of mankind. And so that's one story. And then there's a historical story, which is much more humble, human, temporal story, which is that Kabbalah as we know it, with the major core components and figures that define Kabbalah as we understand it, whether it's the notion of the 10 Sefirot or the 4 worlds or the 5 levels of the soul, like the key, building blocks, the atoms of Kabbalah emerge for the first time with clear historical manuscriptural evidence in 12th century southern France and northern Spain and Provence, and then goes on to flourish from then onwards. And from that, and I genuinely think that there's a lot of rich truth to both of these narratives. And I'm actually not here to be promoting one over the other. I think they both must stand in dynamic relation to one another. And not all truths have to be historical. Truths can be existential, and they're equally, if not more important than historical truths, etc. I need to make these caveats so that I don't get burnt on the stake, But what happens in 12th century Provence is, from a historian's perspective, is that we have a confluence of a bunch of different strains of thought that emerge only in the context of a diaspora. We have Neoplatonism, which really takes a lot of its shape in Alexandria, through Jews like Philo, the Middle Platonist, down to Plotinus, the Neoplatonist, and makes its way through Muslim philosophers and through Christian authors down to Jewish thinkers like Ibn Gabriel, whose text only exists in Latin, Fons Vitae, again, in translation, diaspora, this being in relation with foreign culture. And it's the confluence from a historian's perspective of Jewish ways of thinking mystically about reality that merge in the biblical and later Second Temple period in forms that we retrospectively refer to as Masa Merkava, Masa Bereshit, Hechalot, different forms of Jewish mysticism, which are articulated in a uniquely Jewish language and tongue and textuality in the language of Midrash. We can use that term broadly here. When that encounters medieval forms of Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Greek, Neoplatonism, it finds new language frameworks for articulation, which give birth to what we know as Kabbalah of the Middle Ages. And that's a story which I've told on the channel, and I think is a really important story. And a story which, by the way, only gets heightened when Kabbalah makes its way into 14th century Italy during the Renaissance. We have, again, a rediscovery of Greek thought, of what's thought to be Egyptian thought, of a really wide variety of traditions that are coming together to produce something which none of them could have produced on their own. And I'm not going to get into the scholarly quibbles of how much of this is Neoplatonism and how much is it Gnostic and how much is it Greek and how much is it Egyptian. I'm going to leave that for the scholars to argue until tomorrow. But I think the very point here, and this is a point which perhaps the world's leading scholar of contemporary academia of Jewish mysticism, Moshe Idel, argues for, is that it's only in those moments where there's real communication between neighboring cultures, and he highlights the Renaissance as a key example, and communication that isn't always delightful, but communication nonetheless, that we're able to produce new forms of thought, whether it's humanism, whether it's beautiful articulations of Jewish mysticism, whether it's new forms of Platonism that go on to inspire generations. Those only happen precisely when cultures can be in conversation, in diasporic conversation with one another, when they're interspersed and scattered amongst each other. And what we see as what can be seen as a calamity, this loss of racial, national, spiritual purity, can actually produce something which is profoundly beautiful and human, and can move us to new levels of understanding and new levels of love, develop our ecology of love by being in relationship with the other. Mary Jane Rubenstein has a wonderful book called Pantheologies, and I'll just end on this point. She does, I think, the most brilliant analysis of pantheism that's ever been written. And she writes, she makes this fascinating discovery that every time pantheism, the belief that everything is theos, is God, central to Spinoza, central to mystics in general, to the Stoics and many other philosophers. Every time that word is used in modern literature, it's almost always described as a monstrosity. And no one had really observed this before until Professor Rubenstein had observed this. And she tries to, over the course of a few hundred pages, what she argues is that why is pantheism monstrous out of all things? And she says that what does a monster mean in antiquity and in classical literature? It means the amalgamation of two things that should not have come together. It's like half a demiurge, half a human, half an angel, half an animal. These are monstrosities. And she says that pantheism is a monstrosity because it's mixing together two things that no one wanted to be mixed together, which is the divine and the terrestrial, which is the profane and the sacred. Like, we wanted those separate. And I think that I identify as something of a pan or panentheist. And I think that precisely that intermingling, that diasporic project of mixing together, of creating these beautiful monstrosities, is what allows us to continue to grow and not remain static in our forms of purity. So, I mean, this is all kind of free association. I hope that was somewhat coherent.
Yeah, that was beautiful. And I want to I'll reiterate some of what you said, just with a little bit of a more ecological metaphor. The root of diaspora is the same root as dispersal, to scatter across. And I work in a plant community ecology lab, and seed dispersal is one of the things we're thinking a lot about. And the way that dispersal allows organisms to find a new home, to leave a particular patch and go to a new environment surrounded by a slightly different or radically different community, and the way that then creates a new context in which new relationships and new adaptations allow diversity to persist on the landscape. that can be brought back into the story of Judaism. And I want to turn this towards you because I think our listeners can kind of already see how the community context is really vital for creating new opportunities for innovation, spiritual innovation, physical innovation, structural innovation. But in your own experience with Seekers of Unity, what role has community played in developing your image of spirituality, of Judaism, of Hasidism, or of Hasidot? What is the role of community in your own spiritual growth?
It's really all about community. You know, there's this question that's asked by both academics and Hasidic Jews alike, which is what was the chidush, what was the novelty, what was the innovation that Hasidism, modern Hasidism, Beshtian Hasidism brought to the world, and there's been sort of generations of attempts to answer this in the academic literature, and every time something's proposed, there's kind of the next scholar will show where that already existed in forms of Jewish mysticism that preceded Hasidism, and they'll try to give their own thing, and the next scholar will do the same thing. It's kind of this fun game that scholars engage in. But the Hasidic thinkers and texts ask this question of themselves too. And one particularly interesting answer that appears in Hasidic literature about asking this question of itself, of what was the uftu is the word there used. What is the accomplishment? What did it do? What did we not have already that Hasidus came to do? Why make this whole hullabaloo, in other words? And in ways that kind of interestingly parallel some of the academic discussion, one of the theories proposed by academics is that it's the social dynamic of the office of the tzaddik or the Rebbe and the Rebbe's relationship to their disciples, to the Chassidim, that's the social innovation, which is more of a sociological analysis of Hasidism. So in a way that kind of parallels that to some degree, in some maybe cheeky ways, this Hasidic text answers that before Hasidus, I'll say this in Yiddish and then I'll translate it into English, that before that, vier zu Hasidus, the Rebbe is given Elend and Chassidim is given Elend. Nach Hasidus, the Rebbe is nicht given Elend, Chassidim nicht given Elend. I think that's how it goes in Yiddish. That before Hasidism, the Rebbe was lonely and the Chassidim were lonely. That after Hasidism, the Rebbe was no longer lonely and the Chassid was no longer lonely, which is hilarious because like it's saying that even the existence of the Chassid and Rebbe predates Hasidism, but they were lonely. And loneliness is a big part of mysticism, right? Plotinus, the famed father of Neoplatonism, who we mentioned earlier, describes the spiritual life as the journey of the alone to the alone. Jewish mysticism describes the relationship between God and Abraham. Even earlier texts, classic Jewish texts, describe the relationship between God and Abraham as a relationship between one who was lonely in their world with one who was lonely in his world, namely God in the heavens and Abraham on earth. And in that, there was this relationship between two lonely people. And there's a sense that there's something really lonely about a life of deep existential lovesickness with the object of singularity that is the divine. That it really pushes people off into the mountains and into asylums and into hermitage and into there's this really intense, I should say, Catholic practice of hermitage of cloistering women literally in the walls of a church, and that's where they lived in their unique lovesickness with Jesus, and that's where they lived out their days as brides of Christ. You know, it's a very lonely, almost to the point of morbidity sometimes. And what Chassidus brought, according to its own estimation, is an end to that loneliness. Is that the Rebbe is no longer lonely and Chassidim are no longer lonely. And there's a deep loving relationship between the Rebbe and Chassid. There's a joke told in Chassidic circles, and a joke which masquerades a lot of truth, I think, that the reason why King Solomon ostensibly wrote the Song of Songs, using the metaphor of two lovers, was because he did not have access to the metaphor of Rebbe and Chassid. But if he did, he would have written the greatest love song of human history about Rebbe and Chassid, not about two human, male and female lovers. And it's told as a joke, but told with a lot of seriousness. That there's a immense love relationship that goes on between Rebbe and Chassid, where they they deeply existentially experience each other's pain and joy, and want the best for one another. And it's in that love that the love for the divine is expressed in this world. And that love also exists between Chassidim. The question was asked of a Hasidic rabbi of what is it that makes one a Chassid? And among a few of the answers, one of the answers was that someone who simply spends time, someone who reiben sich zwischen Chassidim is the Yiddish, someone who rubs shoulders with Chassidim, that's what makes someone a Chassid. I think often of the Buddhist saying of in these three I take salvation, in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And the Hasidic version of that might be I take refuge in the Rebbe, in the Torah of the Rebbe, in the Chassidus, and in the Chassidim, like in the Sangha, in the community of Chassidim. So the community is where it all happens. The community is the happening. There's a beautiful notion that comes out of Christianity that the church, the ecclesia, is not a building, but it's the body. It's the body of Jesus, but it's the body of the community of people who come to worship together, and it's their collective bodies which make up the ecclesia, which make up the church. And in that sense, it's the body of the collective body of Hasidism that make up what Hasidus is really. And I hope I'm not going to get any too much flack here for jumping between Buddhism, Christianity, and Hasidism. But maybe that's part of a broader community that we can begin to think about and imagine that goes beyond the boundaries of nationality and particularism without eradicating our beautiful particularism, but can begin to imagine what it means to be in deep community, like Avram Yeshua Heschel modeled for us when he marched with Martin Luther King Jr. What it means to be in deep, loving, responsible relationship and community with all of humanity, and not just humanity, with all of life. And that to me is the dream of Hasidic community, that we can be in deep community with nature, with the birds, with everything that exists. And I think we need that. I think if we don't have that, we're bound to burn it all down, and that's terrifying.
Yeah, I think you just said so much that there's so much to unpack within it. When you talk about Chassidut and the community element of it, it sounds like it's really, really central. And I think the little story you mentioned about how like you had the Chassid and the Rebbe before you had a Chassidut, I think is very interesting. And when we think about my own experience of Jewish community is the central element of it. Like I wouldn't have nearly the Jewish identity that I do have without having so many experiences in different Jewish communities that reinforce this sense of this is part of who I am and where I come from, and I have a desire to take part in these communities and help shape them. But when I've been in Israel especially, I've seen certain Hasidic groups that have a very strange relationship to their Rebbe, where they'll put posters of the Rebbe's face and be like, this is the Moshiach. And it's frankly, it doesn't feel Jewish to me. It feels in a way that's like elevating this person above all the others in a way that's hierarchical and really contrary to that sort of genuine community that Martin Buber really says is like really the element of what we should be building towards in Olam Haba, in the world to come. And it feels really hard to sorry, I'm just trying to think of the language. It seems very hard to put these ideas together of a genuine community where everyone is together and equal and shares the same values. And then you have this Hasidic, I mean, you use the word cult even to describe it, where you have these dynasties with a Rebbe that's passed down from person to person to person, paternally. And it's very strange to me. And I was wondering if you feel like that specific type of relationship between the Rebbe and the Chassid is necessary to that sort of community, or if there's other forms of modeling that community that might actually be more liberating for people as a whole.
Oh, wonderful question. I was just taking some notes here in so I can have something coherent to respond to these delightful questions. Firstly, I have to say, guilty as charged. It's my it's my Hasidic community, the Chabad Hasidic community, which is putting up posters with the picture of the rabbi's face with the words Messiah or Mashiach underneath. So guilty as charged. It's a great question. and there's so much to unpack and explore here, and I kind of want to maybe flesh out like 3 or 4 points that can give some context to this. Yes.
Just to kind of reiterate my actual question, like what is it about the Rebbe that makes the Hasidic movement and tradition and communities so, like what is it about the Rebbe as an individual that shapes these communities in this kind of way?
Yeah. So we need some historical and metaphysical background to answer that question, because the Rebbe is not just a social functionary. The Rebbe is a metaphysical function within the Hasidic community. The understanding that's put forth by the Zohar and expounded in later texts and thinkers of Jewish mysticism is that the same way that when God creates the world, from the perspective of Jewish mysticism and classical Jewish texts, that the divine energy, if we can use that kind of bizarre translation, the shefa, the overflow from God, which is actually perhaps a translation from Maimonides, from the Arabic fayed, which is a Neoplatonic term. Again, we're seeing here the interspersing, the interceding of ideas here in these very words that we're using. The divine overflow, which brings the world into existence and keeps in existence from the perspective of Jewish texts and Jewish tradition, comes from God, visualized conceptually as almost like a really like a phallic beam or line that emerges from the divine realm to the human realm, and the roles of circles and lines and spirals are all part of the mythos of Kabbalah, but they come to the world at a specific point, and from that point they begin to kind of form the world. And again, this is all conceptual and abstract. No, I don't want anyone to visualize like an actual column coming down from the sky to bring the world into existence, but conceptually at least, and mythologically, there's a single point which is seen almost as the umbilical point, like the belly button of reality, from which the rest of existence comes into being. And that point, according to Jewish texts, is the foundation stone which sits eventually beneath the Ark of the Covenant and the Holies of Holies on Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount. And it's that point which begins creation. And in that sense, it is, what someone like Mircea Eliade would call the place of the sacred, the axios mundi, the column of existence from which existence emerges and continues to emerge from, which is why in Judaism it's the most sacred place. Only the high priest enters once a year, and even then, it could be a fatal opportunity even for the high priest, and many die in their encounter with the utmost sacred. From the perspective of Jewish mysticism, the same way that process metaphysically happens in a geographical sense, it also happens in a human sense, in a point of souls. And the soul, which is the prophet, which is the place where the divine enters reality, beginning with Adam, Abraham, Moses, etc., that happens in every single generation. And it's the archetype of Moses, that's reincarnated in every generation, which is the axios mundi, which is the column through which the divine overflow enters the world. So in terms of like beefing this up metaphysically, this is about as far as we can get. It's in the language of the Aramaic Zohar, it's the ispashtusa de Moshe b'chol dar v'dar. It's the spark, the overflow of Moses in every generation that is that central point, which is the umbilical cord between the human and the divine. And from the perspective of Hasidism, particularly from Chabad Hasidism, which I was raised in, it is the Rebbe who in every generation is that metaphysical Moses figure. And we find the same ideas in Islamic mysticism about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who is the perfect human who, like Moses, is this sort of demiurgical, half human, half divine figure through whom the flow of divinity passes. Now, this may sound like crazy stuff to like contemporary Jewish podcast listening audiences, and I think I'm actually not going to apologize for any of this. I think that the apology has to be made on behalf of our Jewish educations, which don't actually give us exposure to the real panoply and smorgasbord, which is Jewish theologies and textuality. Like, I'm not making anything up here. Like, this is Jewish theologies through the ages. And we've constructed a version of Judaism which is so parv, which is so vanilla, that like Judaism is just tikkun olam and nothing else, and we're here to be or Goyim. Like, Judaism is crazy. Like, we have a lot going on metaphysically. We have a lot of weird, like, we really have to be more in touch with the weirdness, the queerness of Judaism. So I'm not going to apologize for any of that. So, but it is the Rebbe who is this figure, who is the messianic, mosaic, prophetic, metaphysical linchpin of reality, who allows reality to stay in being. From the perspective of Jewish mysticism, which we see again reiterated in early Christianity, there's an equivalence between the Rebbe, the prophet, and the temple, right? When God destroys the temple, it's either destroying the temple or destroying the leader, the Moses of the generation. Moses dies so that the Jews can stay and have their lives saved on their behalf. This sort of, again, all the things that we think are like Christian ideas, these are originally Jewish ideas. So the Rebbe the Tzaddik, another term used interchangeably, plays a really, really important role in terms of keeping reality in existence, and also in terms of the continual divine revelation happens through the mouth of the Rebbe. The Talmud says that when we sit at the feet of the Rebbe, it's like we're sitting at the feet of Sinai again to hear the revelation of God through Moses. Like, this is what the Talmud says. This is like pretty mainstream kind of stuff, right? So these things exist, and hierarchy exists in Judaism. We have hierarchies where we have the Kohen, we have the Levite, we have the Israelite, and there's different roles and responsibilities. We have teachers and students, we have all these kinds of things. Now, after having built up all those hierarchies, I would like to say that from the perspective of Jewish mysticism, this is all kind of diasporic in some sense. It's all kind of exilic. Not to equate those words, but that there is a paradigm shift which we can come to, where we're able to move beyond these hierarchies. And the key biblical passage which the Hasidic thinkers play with in this discussion is when Korach confronts Moses and asks Moses literally this question of Lama tisnasu akal Hashem, why are you raising yourself above the people? You yourself, Moses, told us that we all have the divine within us. When Moses was confronted by Joshua, when Eldad and Medad were prophesying in the camp, although they hadn't been pulled in the lottery of the 70 elders, Moses says, why are you complaining? Halavai, I wish that all Jews would be speaking prophecy, because they all have God within them. They all have the divine within them. Let them all prophesize. Mi yitain, like, if only they would all see their prophetic capacities and see that they're all a spark of Moses. And what happens in that moment, I'm not going to get into the complexities of the Hasidic metaphysics of the discussion between Korach and Moses, because why Korach was wrong, but the question that Hasidus poses is that the assumption here is that Korach is actually right, that Moses should not be elevated amongst the people, that we're all the divine, and we all need to speak that. And this is reflected in the prophet Jeremiah in chapter 31, where the prophet says that in the days to come, in the eschatological end of days, in the messianic period, no man will need to teach their brother, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the greatest of them to the smallest of them. And I will give a new Torah in their hearts, etc., etc. So the basic understanding, just to wrap up the narrative here from the perspective of Jewish mysticism and Hasidism, is that the function of Moses is a necessary one to bring us to the realization that we're all Moses and we do not need that function anymore. That what happens in that discussion is Moses says, I'm here to serve the people, to teach them that they're all here to be servants, that you're here to be a nation of priests to serve in each one of you. And I think that what happens, to sort of drift away from the metaphysics to some sociology here, I think what happens in the Hasidic community is that we create these figures that have literally absolute divine authority. And what happens in that process is we abnegate our own divine responsibility to them. And we say, the Rebbe will be the one who will take care of my work, and I just need to come and hold on to the Rebbe's doorknob, and I'll have my ticket into heaven through that. And the Chassidus that I was raised on was radically opposed to that, and radically promoted the fact that each one of us must be our own Rebbe. Each one of us must stand up to be our own Moses and do the work that it takes in our own lives to bring our own redemptions and to bring that redemption to others, and to really undermine its own construct of of the hierarchy that it itself creates to bring its own. There's the seeds of its own subversion are planted very heavily in it, and I think that's particularly true in Chabad Hasidic mysticism, where the Rebbe from the very first public discourse to the very last was challenging the people to stand up as individuals and as leaders. And I think part of why the Rebbe, my Rebbe, the seventh Lubavitch Rebbe, left no active plan of succession, had no children, had no successor to follow him, which he certainly had the capacity to, was because he wanted every single Jew and every single Chassid to stand up and be their Rebbe. And that's the only way, I think, that he saw the end game happening. So long as we continue to rely upon hierarchies and powerful men to lead us into redemption, we never can be led into redemption unless we step onto our own 2 feet. And I think the same way that Moses lets himself, strikes the stone, and dies on Har Nevoi in the desert, so that the people themselves are forced to walk in without any powerful men leading them, so that they themselves can bring that redemption, is, I think, part of what's going on here. And I know that we're kind of moving fluidly between history and sociology and metaphysics, but I think that's kind of what's going on here. And there's obviously a lot, but that's maybe some directions.
I think that was really rich and at a depth that's pretty new to this podcast. We haven't delved very deeply into Jewish metaphysics. But to kind of return to some of the more common themes you mentioned, Tikkun Olam isn't the whole picture of Judaism, but it is a pretty important one in the sense that, like, what is the human responsibility on the earth? But I think the story you just told us of this transformation of the metaphysical center of the world within Jewish communities from a Zionist conception of the center of the earth is in Jerusalem to a Chabad Hasidic tradition where the center of the world is within the heart of, or the mind of the Rebbe, towards, I'm constantly reminded of Buber's arc from a man who was mystically intoxicated in this solitude of divinity, seeing, the way that I connect to God is by retreating into myself, but then having this radical break and realizing that I cannot find truth solely within myself, and I have to move into the community. I need to find God within dialogue. And I'm drawn to the image that through this dialogue, through collaborating with others in the world, through community, we actively participate in Tikkun Olam, we actively participate in Tikkun Olam, in repairing the world and in constructing the world to come. I have one last question, and I apologize if we don't have enough time to really flesh it out. But within your project of Seekers of Unity, you've talked a little bit about sort of a perennial philosophy, a religion 2.0, a religion that transcends divisions between religions. And I'm really curious how you see this project in relationship with the contemporary and intersecting crises of faith, of community, of ecology, of climate change. How do these things connect? How do you see yourself participating in Tikkun Olam?
Yeah. So firstly, I just want to make it clear that I'm not, God forbid, I'm not throwing any shade on Tikkun Olam. Tikkun Olam is a very, very central idea, both in contemporary and in traditional Judaism. I was just perhaps bemoaning that it's the only thing that people know of contemporary Judaism. When Tikkun Olam is a central pillar, surrounded by a rich ecology, and in the absence of that ecology, we forget what the central pillar is even about. And the Barbarian project, which I think we can follow in his text, where he moves, as you're saying, from his early works like Daniel, which is very sort of internal with his relationship with the divine within, to the divine which is in between, in dialogue. I think is a really monumental move, which highlights some of this Hasidic ethos that we've been discussing. That was kind of in response to your response. But what precisely was your question? Because I want to make sure I'm fully understanding what the question is.
So my question is, we're living in a time where there's these looming crises of climate change, of the sixth mass extinction on the earth, of alienation from the community, from society, of a lapse in any faith in our institutions, and the role of religion. what is the position of seekers of unity in trying to find that unity and bring about a positive change in the world, bring us towards the world to come?
Oh, yeah, we often think about crisis in sort of catastrophic terms, and it's could be crippling. It could freeze us up, put us into kind of fight or flight modes where we're not really thinking with our full being. Just kind of the amygdala just trying to respond to these existential threats. And I want to think about crisis a little differently. I want to think about crisis as an opportunity for radical change, where and this is actually sometimes how the word is used. Crisis comes from the Greek word of decision, actually, that there's moments where we have to like decide which way are we going about this. I'm just doing some research now on ritual for an upcoming video, and we talk about life cycle events as life crisis events, and not in a pejorative or negative sense, like marriage, birth, death. These are all crises, like the moments where we have to make a decision about who we are going forward. And I think we are collectively poised this crisis ahead of us. And the crisis that you're saying, Jordan, really is multifaceted. And I think interrelated and interconnected, social, economical, ecological, spiritual, existential, institutional, really on all fronts, we're facing tremendous crisis. And I think it forces us to really rethink our most basic assumptions about ourselves and reality. I humbly think that the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves and reality go on to shape the worlds that we live in. We create our worlds through the stories that we tell, and whether that's through our myths, through our theologies, through our sciences, these are stories that we're telling ourselves. And I think that when we face a moment of mass crisis, we're forced to examine our stories and the stories that brought us that crisis, and to see whether those stories have what they take to not extricate us, but to allow us to make the right decisions in those crises so that we can reach a place of flourishing and eudaimonia in the ecology of life that we are part and participating in. And in my I spent I don't want to say that I've like that I know every story out there, but for a while as a young teenager, I was a very curious young man. And I went on a real process of thinking and exploration and reading different stories, essentially. And the story of the mystics, told from a perennialist or neo-perennialist standpoint. And I'll say briefly what that story is, and perhaps we can use Buber to help tell that story. To me, has been the best story that I've told, that I've heard, to face the crises that we're in, to face those decisions that we have. The story that the way that Buber puts it in kind of this very mythopoetic language, is that all there was the self, was the divine self, and that self was lonely and wanted to come to know itself, to be in relationship, and it splintered off itself from itself so that it could come to again know itself. And in the process of letting go of our limited conceptions of self, we can come to re-encounter who we really are, which is all of reality, and encounter the selfhood that embraces reality as a whole. And through the works of people like Van Gennep and Mircea Eliade and others, where there's a really important process in nature talking about seeds, and this is used by many mystical traditions, that the seed must first disintegrate in the ground before it can be reborn into a tree or a plant or a fruit. That likewise, our conception of self is that seed which we have to let go of. We have to let go of our false sense of selfhood. And this we can find from anyone from Maimonides to David Hume to the Buddhists, to let go of that false self in an act what Hasidus calls bitul, so that we can be reborn as in relationship to our complete self, which is the divine, which is all of reality. And to me, that's what unity means in its grandest meaning. It means to really radically, through our experiences, cognition, and practices, reconceptualize the very notion of selfhood from away from a restricted, selfish, um, limited, isolated, notion of selfhood to one which through a process of letting that die so that it can be reborn in a collective sense, and a collective selfhood. And to me, when we can do that step, we've, not to sound too utopian about it, because I think this is really I don't know if we ever get there, but I think we can always strive towards there. We can emerge into a relationship with reality where we're not other than anything else, right? Where everything that we encounter is a reflection, is part of the self. And to me, that is the answer to the crisis of the loneliness epidemic. That is the answer to the crisis of social income, and welfare disparity and inequality, because I can no longer mistreat the pauper when I realize that they're part of the self, but their care becomes my care and their pain becomes my pain. That's to me, that's part of the answer to the question posed by the ecological crisis, that I can't allow the forest to disappear, because that forest is part of my blood and it's part of my soul. I want to even move away from the metaphysical here. I want to say, on a purely scientific sense, that we are this earth, right? This is the stuff that's in our lungs and in our blood, and we return to the earth and we come from the earth, and we belong to it. We belong to each other. And to me, whether we want to tell that story from a perspective of psychology, neuroscience, metaphysics, sociology, biology, systems theory, however we want to tell that story, to me, that's the story that the mystics, in all of their various stripes and flavors and forms, are coming to tell. And it's a story which I keep returning to in my own life, in my own crises. And it's not a pansina. It's not a pill that you swallow and it fixes anything. It's a charge. It's a calling to live as if that's true. Um, and that's, as a seeker of unity, that's that's the story that I want to be engaging in and articulating and trying to live, and failing, but getting back up and trying again.
That's beautiful. I think, answering that kind of question in about 8 minutes is pretty impressive. And to get beyond our notions of self, to get beyond of our notions of otherness, to see that, there's other within us and there's other without, there's self within us and there's self without. And this is where love comes back into it, to see that we have to extend who we are to include our communities, to include our ecosystems, to include our whole biosphere. How else will we elevate the what's good in the world? How will we bring about a world where all people can be included, can be one as part of a real community? I think this just about wraps up our time together. I want to just thank you so much for sharing all the teachings and wisdom and stories that cut so near and dear to your heart, but also cut across those transcultural divides within Judaism and beyond. And it's just such an honor to have you here. Thank you for, sharing the diasporic mysticism that weaves all these strands together into something greater, something that hits at what I see as a real core to human existence. It's really been wonderful.
It's been such a delight to join you guys in conversation, and I'm looking forward to staying in community and friendship and in love with you guys. And yeah, and thank you for bringing that analysis and that lens to my own work, of allowing me to see myself as a diasporic mystic, and seeing, as a diasporic Jew as well, and see a diasporic Hasid, seeing all of those, seeing the beauty in that. You've added something to my own self-conception, and for that I'm grateful.
Thank you so much, Zevi. It's been such a pleasure. We're really excited to have you and to be able to explore this with you. And I hope we definitely can stay in touch. You've genuinely been an inspiration for me as well. Jordan really brought you to me, and I've actually shared you. I'm currently working at my synagogue, which I grew up in, as an educator for the 6th graders and for 8th, 9th graders. And I actually used a couple of clips from your videos to explain like a pantheist conception of God. And it's been really wonderful to be able to bring you to people and to be able to have you on our show and really Bless your soul. We're really grateful to have you.
What a tremendous privilege. What a really tremendous privilege to be engaged with this kind of work with fine people like yourself. And I'm so looking forward to when this is out and ready so I can share it with my friends and community. Because I really feel like something really beautiful emerged in the in-between here in this conversation, as Buber might put it.
Thank you so much, Zevi.